The cold of January 1943 settled over the deserts of Tunisia like an unexpected visitor, the kind of chill that made men who had trained for North African heat huddle around fires and wonder if any landscape on Earth could be comfortable. Near the town of Fide, where American forces held defensive positions against the advancing Africa Corps, Second Lieutenant Edward R. Kirkland of the 1st Armored Division sat in his Sherman tank going over the day's orders with his crew. He was 24 years old, a native of Kentucky, who had joined the Army 2 years earlier when war seemed inevitable, who had trained in armored warfare because tanks represented modernity and power, and the kind of mechanized combat that would define this conflict. What he could not have known, as he checked fuel levels and ammunition stores that cold morning, was that within hours he would begin an odyssey of capture and escape that would test every assumption he held about his own capabilities and the nature of human determination. The German attack came at dawn, a coordinated assault by elements of the 21st Panzer Division that had been planning this operation for weeks, while American intelligence remained largely ignorant of German intentions and capabilities in the sector. Rommel's forces struck with the kind of professional competence that characterized the Africa Corps at its best. Combined arms coordination, aggressive maneuver, overwhelming firepower concentrated at decisive points. The American positions, held by troops still learning the realities of mechanized warfare against an experienced enemy, collapsed faster than anyone had predicted. Kirkland's tank took 2 hits from a German 75mm gun before he could effectively return fire, the second round penetrating the engine compartment and setting it ablaze with a fury that gave the crew perhaps 30 seconds to evacuate before the ammunition cooked off. He emerged from the burning Sherman into chaos, American vehicles retreating in disorder, German panzers advancing through defensive positions that no longer existed as coherent military formations, infantry everywhere trying to find cover or surrender or simply survive the next few minutes. Kirkland ran, not in any particular direction but away from the German advance, joining other American soldiers in the instinctive flight that characterized military collapse. He covered perhaps 200 yards before a German infantry squad appeared from behind a destroyed half-track, their rifles raised, their shouts in German universally comprehensible, even to those who spoke no German. He raised his hands. The battle continued around him, but his part in it had ended. The initial processing of prisoners occurred in a commandeered building that had once been a French colonial administrative office, now serving as temporary collection point for the dozens of Americans captured during the morning's fighting. Kirkland was searched, his personal effects confiscated, except for identification and a few photographs, his uniform inspected for intelligence value. The German soldiers who processed him were professional, neither friendly nor hostile, executing the bureaucratic procedures that transformed American combatant into German prisoner. He was given water, allowed to sit, told through a translator that he would be transported to a permanent facility within 24 hours. The translator, a German sergeant who spoke English with a slight British accent, learned during pre-war studies in London, explained that cooperation would be rewarded with correct treatment according to Geneva Convention standards, that resistance would accomplish nothing except personal hardship. But Kirkland, sitting among 40 other captured Americans in that improvised holding facility, was already thinking not about cooperation but about escape. The thought came not from careful planning or tactical assessment, but from something more fundamental: the absolute refusal to accept captivity as permanent condition, the conviction that being prisoner was temporary state to be rectified at first opportunity. He had been trained to fight. He had not been trained to sit passively while Germans processed him through their prisoner handling system. The idea of escape, even in the first hours of capture before he understood anything about German security procedures or the geography of North Africa, became not optional objective but fundamental necessity. The transport to the permanent camp occurred the following day. 40 prisoners loaded into covered trucks under armed guard for a journey that took approximately 6 hours through desert landscape that offered no landmarks, no indication of direction or distance, just endless variations of sand and rock broken, occasionally by settlements that war had reduced to architectural skeletons. The camp, when they reached it, was what the Germans called a Dulag, a transit facility where prisoners were held temporarily before being shipped to permanent camps in Europe. It consisted of wire fencing surrounding several large tents, guard towers at each corner, a single gate that opened only to admit or release vehicles. Perhaps 300 prisoners occupied the facility, mostly British captured in earlier fighting, with a growing number of Americans as Rommel's offensive continued to roll up unprepared American positions. The conditions were harsh but not deliberately cruel. Food was minimal: thin soup, hard bread, water that tasted of chemicals used to make it safe, but sufficient to prevent starvation. Medical care existed for those seriously wounded, though the German medical staff was overwhelmed by casualties from their own forces and gave prisoners only attention that immediate necessity demanded. The guards maintained order through presence rather than brutality, though everyone understood that serious infractions would be met with serious consequences. The overall atmosphere was one of enforced waiting, of men existing in suspended animation until bureaucratic machinery moved them to their next destination. Kirkland studied this environment with the intensity of someone planning not to remain in it. He observed guard rotations, noting that they followed predictable patterns, that the same soldiers appeared at the same times, that professionalism sometimes shaded into routine that bred inattention. He examined the wire fencing, discovering that in several places the posts had been driven into soft ground that offered possibility of creating gaps if sufficient force could be applied. He talked with British prisoners who had been there longer, learning about previous escape attempts, about which approaches had failed and why, about the geography beyond the wire and what lay in various directions. The symbolic object that would define Kirkland's first escape attempt was a length of wire he salvaged from a discarded ration crate, 6 feet of flexible steel that could be bent into tools or weapons that represented the difference between passive acceptance and active resistance. He fashioned this wire into a crude prying tool, testing its strength against various obstacles, learning through experimentation what it could accomplish. The wire became talisman, physical reminder that even in captivity resources existed for those willing to look for them. That imprisonment was condition of circumstance rather than permanent state. The first escape occurred on the 5th night of his captivity. Kirkland had identified a section of fence where 2 posts stood slightly farther apart than standard spacing, where the wire between them sagged marginally, where a gap existed that a determined man might exploit. He waited until the guard rotation placed the least attentive soldiers in the towers, until darkness was complete, and other prisoners had settled into sleep routines that would not be disturbed by his movement. He crawled to the fence, worked his improvised pry bar between wire strands, pulled with strength augmented by desperation until the gap widened enough to squeeze through. And then he was outside the wire, outside the camp, running into North African darkness with no plan beyond putting distance between himself and captivity. The freedom lasted approximately 18 hours. Kirkland moved through the night, avoiding roads and settlements, guided by stars he half-remembered from navigation training, trying to head east toward Allied lines whose location he could only guess. When dawn came, he found shelter in a wadi, a dry riverbed that offered concealment if not comfort, and tried to sleep through the day's heat. But survival in the desert required resources he did not possess. Water most critically, but also food, proper clothing for temperature extremes, knowledge of terrain and safe routes. By the second night, severely dehydrated and disoriented, he approached what he thought was an isolated farmhouse hoping to find water. Instead, he found a German supply depot, walked directly into a patrol, and was recaptured before he could flee. The punishment for escape was predictable: isolation in a punishment cell for 3 days, reduced rations, interrogation about whether other prisoners had assisted or planned additional attempts. But the Germans, while disappointed by the breach in their security, seemed almost to expect that some prisoners would try to escape, treated it as natural consequence of imprisoning military men whose duty included attempting return to their own forces. The interrogating officer, a captain who spoke excellent English, told Kirkland directly that escape attempts were understood but would always result in recapture, that the desert was more effective prison than any fence, that cooperation served his interest better than continued resistance. Kirkland listened, gave the required responses, and immediately began planning his second attempt. The first escape had taught him valuable lessons, primarily that simply getting outside the wire was insufficient, that successful escape required preparation, resources, knowledge of terrain and distance to friendly forces. He needed better information about geography, needed supplies that would sustain him for longer periods, needed to understand German security measures well enough to avoid the mistakes that had led to his recapture. The opportunity came 3 weeks later when prisoners were organized into work details to repair bomb damage at a nearby airfield. The work was hard, moving rubble and filling craters under North African sun, but it provided what Kirkland desperately needed: access to the world outside the camp, observation of German military operations, contact with civilian Arabs who might provide information or assistance. During one work detail, while guards' attention was focused elsewhere, Kirkland slipped away from his work group, walked calmly toward a line of damaged aircraft as though he belonged there, then sprinted for the perimeter when he judged himself far enough from immediate observation. This second escape lasted longer, nearly 4 days, because Kirkland had learned from his first attempt. He traveled only at night, found better hiding places during daylight hours, located a source of water in an abandoned well that probably explained why certain ruins remained inhabited by local shepherds. He avoided all buildings and roads, kept to terrain that offered concealment, rationed his energy more carefully. But North Africa in 1943 was thoroughly militarized, every square mile either occupied by Axis forces or so remote that survival became impossible. He was recaptured by an Italian patrol on the 4th day, hungry and exhausted but uninjured, and returned once again to German custody. The second recapture resulted in harsher treatment: 2 weeks in isolation, interrogation that was more aggressive though still professional, a warning from the camp commandant that further escape attempts would result in transfer to a more secure facility where conditions were substantially worse. But the commandant, a career officer who had served in the Great War and understood something about soldier psychology, also expressed a grudging respect for Kirkland's determination. Escape attempts, he noted, were the mark of a soldier who maintained his spirit despite defeat. Germany respected such spirit even while containing it. But transfer to a more secure facility was not threat, but opportunity. In April 1943, along with 200 other prisoners, Kirkland was loaded onto a ship bound for Italy, first step in the journey to permanent camps in Germany, where he would spend the remainder of the war. The sea voyage took 3 days. Prisoners packed into the hold with minimal facilities, seasick and miserable, but at least moving away from the African desert that had proven so effective at preventing escape. Italy, he reasoned, might offer better opportunities: more complex terrain, civilian populations potentially sympathetic to escapees, proximity to neutral Switzerland or Allied-occupied southern Italy if he could reach it. The Italian camp where he was initially held was located near Naples, a facility that housed several thousand Allied prisoners in conditions that varied from adequate to deliberately harsh, depending on guards' moods and available resources. The Italians, by mid-1943, were losing enthusiasm for a war that Germany seemed increasingly likely to lose, that had brought them nothing but hardship and casualties in theaters from North Africa to Russia. This waning enthusiasm translated into security measures that were professional but not fanatical, that could be studied and potentially exploited by prisoners determined enough to attempt escape. Kirkland spent 3 months in the Italian camp working in labor details, learning Italian from fellow prisoners who had been captured earlier, studying the routines and procedures that governed daily life. He made contact with other escape-minded prisoners, forming loose networks of men who shared information and planned various attempts with varying degrees of sophistication. Some efforts succeeded in getting men outside the wire, but failed at the harder task of reaching Allied lines or neutral territory. Others never got beyond planning stages, betrayed by informers or discovered through German security measures that remained effective despite Italian indifference. His third escape attempt came in July 1943, shortly before the Allied invasion of Sicily made such attempts both more urgent and more feasible. Kirkland and 2 other Americans, a lieutenant named Harrison and a sergeant named O'Brien, had obtained Italian civilian clothes through complex trades with camp workers, had accumulated small amounts of food suitable for carrying, had studied maps showing routes south toward what they hoped would be Allied advances up the Italian peninsula. Their plan was simple. During a work detail outside the camp, they would slip away during a moment of guard inattention, change into civilian clothes, and attempt to reach Allied lines by moving south through the countryside, avoiding major roads and German military installations. The escape succeeded in its initial phase. They slipped away from the work detail, changed clothes, began moving south through Italian agricultural landscape that offered both cover and sources of food from fields and farms. For 5 days they made good progress, covering perhaps 40 miles, encountering Italian civilians who were sometimes helpful and sometimes suspicious, but rarely actively hostile. Italy, in July 1943, was a nation exhausted by war, its people more concerned with survival than with Allied prisoners moving through their territory. Some Italians provided food or shelter, others simply looked away, tacitly permitting passage by choosing not to report what they had seen. But on the 6th day, approaching what they believed was an area under Allied control based on outdated information, they walked into a German checkpoint that was sweeping for Italian army deserters. The Germans were surprised to encounter American prisoners far from any known facility, but professional training overcame surprise quickly. Kirkland and his companions were detained, identified, and transported back to German custody, not to the Italian camp they had escaped from, but to a German-run facility where security was substantially tighter and escape prospects correspondingly worse. This third recapture marked a turning point. The Germans classified Kirkland as a persistent escape risk, someone requiring maximum security measures. He was transferred to a German stalag, a permanent prisoner camp, where thousands of Allied prisoners lived in conditions governed by strict German military discipline, where escape attempts were punished severely, where the entire facility had been designed specifically to prevent what Kirkland had attempted 3 times already. The camp was in southern Germany, far from any conceivable route to Allied lines or neutral territory, surrounded by a hostile population that had been conditioned to report escaped prisoners immediately to authorities. The conditions in the German stalag represented the full weight of systematic German military organization: guard towers with machine guns covering every angle, multiple wire fences with gravel areas between them that made silent crossing impossible, regular roll calls that would detect absence within hours, punishment systems for escape attempts that could include everything from solitary confinement to execution depending on circumstances. The other prisoners, some of whom had been there since 1940 or 1941, advised him that escape was effectively impossible, that the best strategy was to survive until Allied victory freed them, that continued resistance served no purpose beyond personal satisfaction. But Kirkland could not, or would not, accept this advice. The idea of remaining prisoner until war's end, of sitting passively while others fought to end the conflict, violated something fundamental in his character. He had tried 3 times. Each attempt had failed. But each failure had taught lessons, had refined his understanding of what worked and what did not, had made him more rather than less determined to succeed. The question was not whether to attempt escape again, but when and how. The opportunity came in March 1945, when the war's end was approaching but Allied armies had not yet reached the camp, when German security was focused more on preventing chaos as the Reich collapsed than on maintaining rigid control over prisoners whose release seemed inevitable. Kirkland, with 3 other Americans who shared his determination, planned what would be his 4th and final escape attempt. They had obtained German worker passes through complex forgeries, had civilian clothes hidden in their barracks, had studied guard schedules enough to identify a brief window when changing rotations might create confusion sufficient to permit passage through the gate. The escape succeeded. They walked out of the camp during a shift change, dressed in worker clothing, carrying forged passes that German guards checked, but did not scrutinize closely in the chaos of late-war Germany. They made their way west, moving through a landscape of disintegrating German military organization, avoiding combat zones, encountering German units that were either retreating in disorder or had simply dissolved as soldiers decided survival meant going home rather than continuing pointless resistance. For 12 days they moved through central Germany, sometimes helped by civilians who recognized the war was lost and saw no point in detaining Allied prisoners, sometimes simply ignored by German military units too focused on their own survival to care about escaped POWs. On the 13th day, they encountered an American armored column advancing through what had been German defensive positions, but was now simply territory the Germans had abandoned. The American soldiers were initially suspicious. Escaped POWs appearing from behind what was theoretically enemy lines always raised questions about whether they might be German infiltrators. But Kirkland's identification, his detailed knowledge of American military organization, and his obvious exhaustion from 13 days of evading capture convinced the unit commander that these were genuine escapees rather than enemy agents. The journey home took 2 months of bureaucratic processing, medical evaluation, debriefing by intelligence officers interested in what he had observed during his time in captivity and his multiple escapes. He returned to the United States in July 1945, the war in Europe over, his service complete, carrying medals for valor and for the single accomplishment that defined his wartime experience. He had been captured once, had escaped 4 times with the final attempt succeeding, had refused to accept captivity as permanent condition even when every rational assessment suggested that acceptance served his interests better than continued resistance. The symbolic significance of Kirkland's multiple escapes extended beyond his personal story to represent something about American military culture and American character more broadly. German and British military traditions honored duty and courage, but also recognized that continued resistance after capture sometimes became futile gesture rather than effective contribution. American military culture, shaped by frontier traditions and democratic principles that emphasized individual agency, treated escape attempts differently, not as futile gestures but as fundamental duty, as expression of the conviction that free men did not remain captive when opportunity for freedom existed. Kirkland's wire tool, his civilian disguises, his forged passes, these objects represented the material resources of escape, but the determination that drove him to 4 separate attempts represented something less tangible: the refusal to internalize defeat, the conviction that capture was temporary condition rather than permanent state, the belief that individual agency mattered even when circumstances seemed to render it meaningless. Each escape attempt failed, except the last, yet each attempt represented resistance to the reality that German captivity tried to impose, that prisoners should accept their status, should wait passively for liberation, should recognize that individual action could not overcome systematic German security measures. The transformation his experience represented was not dramatic conversion, but rather reinforcement of character traits that American culture cultivated: independence, initiative, refusal to accept authority that lacked legitimate claim to obedience. German captors expected prisoners to behave rationally, to recognize that cooperation served their interests better than resistance, to accept that German military organization was too effective to be overcome by individual action. But Kirkland's multiple escapes demonstrated that determination could sometimes achieve what rational calculation suggested was impossible, that the very unpredictability of individual initiative could exploit weaknesses in even the most systematic organizations. The German officers who repeatedly recaptured him seemed genuinely puzzled by his persistence. They treated escape attempts as violations of rules that ought to be obvious to anyone thinking clearly, as failures to recognize that German security measures had been designed by professionals to prevent exactly what Kirkland attempted. But American military culture operated from different premises: that rules imposed by captors lacked moral force even if enforced through power, that duty to resist continued even after capture, that individual determination possessed value independent of its success rate. Edward R. Kirkland died in 1987. Having lived a long life that included career in business, marriage, children, all the ordinary accomplishments of men who survived the war and built post-war lives. His obituary mentioned his military service, his medals, his multiple escape attempts during German captivity. But the deeper significance of his story lay not in its outcome. Millions of POWs were eventually liberated by Allied victory, but in what it revealed about the relationship between individual character and systematic power. The German Stalags were designed to make escape effectively impossible, to demonstrate that individual resistance was futile against organized state power, to teach prisoners that cooperation and patience served their interests better than continued defiance. But Kirkland's 4 escapes, 3 recaptures, and final success demonstrated that systematic power, however thoroughly organized, could not completely eliminate individual agency, that determination and initiative retained significance even when rational calculation suggested they were futile, that the choice to resist rather than accept possessed value independent of its likelihood of success. The wire tool he fashioned in the North African transit camp, used once and then confiscated, represented in miniature the larger story. that even in captivity, resources existed for those determined to find them. That imprisonment was condition of circumstance rather than inevitable fate. That individuals could shape outcomes even when overwhelming power suggested they could not. Each escape attempt was gamble. Each recapture seemed to prove that German security measures were indeed effective. Yet Kirkland continued attempting escape not because success was probable, but because the alternative, passive acceptance of captivity, was incompatible with how he understood himself and his duty. The story of Edward R. I. Kirkland resonates because it represents something Americans like to believe about themselves, that they do not accept imposed limitations, that individual determination matters even when organizational power seems overwhelming, that freedom is active choice requiring effort rather than passive condition granted by authority. His multiple escapes demonstrated not that escape was easy or even probable, but that the decision to attempt it was within individual control even when circumstances seemed to preclude success. The Germans could imprison him, could recapture him repeatedly, could design ever more sophisticated security systems, but they could not make him stop trying, could not force him to internalize his captivity as permanent condition, could not prevent him from continuing to resist until resistance finally succeeded in achieving what three previous failures suggested was impossible.